Joseph Anthony Manhard was a 32-year-old man living in Utah who had been involved in a romantic relationship with a woman who worked as a healthcare professional. She provided medical services by visiting patients in their homes, a common practice for healthcare workers who care for elderly or homebound individuals. The relationship between Manhard and this woman had ended on the 5th day of September, just days before the violent events that would unfold. In the period following their breakup, Manhard's behavior became increasingly erratic, unstable, and frightening. He had been using heroin, a highly addictive opioid drug that police believed he had started using several months before these incidents occurred. His drug use would play a central and devastating role in the violent crime spree that was about to unfold across multiple cities in Utah. On the 8th day of September, Manhard decided to confront his ex-girlfriend. He knew her work schedule and knew that she traveled to various homes to see patients. He tracked her down and appeared at her vehicle while she was leaving the residence of one of her patients after completing a home visit. Healthcare workers are particularly vulnerable in these situations because they often work alone and travel to unfamiliar locations. Manhard approached her car and got into the passenger seat without her permission. He produced a handgun and pointed it at her. He kidnapped her at gunpoint, forcing her into the vehicle and taking control of the situation. He initially forced her to stay in the car with him as he drove around, holding her captive. Eventually, he abandoned her somewhere and took her vehicle, leaving her traumatized but physically unharmed. She immediately reported the incident to police, providing them with a description of Manhard and the stolen vehicle. This kidnapping and vehicle theft was not entirely unexpected behavior from Manhard to those who knew him, as he had been showing increasingly disturbing signs of instability in the days leading up to this incident. Days before the kidnapping, Manhard had sent his ex-girlfriend a deeply disturbing and threatening photograph via text message or social media. The image showed a handgun alongside what appeared to be heroin and drug paraphernalia clearly visible in the frame. It was an implicit threat, a window into his deteriorating mental state, and a clear indication of his willingness to use violence. The photograph suggested he was armed, using hard drugs, and potentially dangerous. This should have been a warning sign of the violence to come, though it's unclear whether his ex-girlfriend reported this threatening image to police at the time. The very next day, on the 9th of September, Manhard's own family became terrified of him and feared for their lives. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, Manhard's brother made an urgent and panicked call to emergency services. The audio recording of the call captured the fear in his voice. He told the dispatcher in no uncertain terms that he needed the cops at his location as soon as possible. His voice was shaking as he explained the situation. He told dispatch that Joseph had a firearm on him and was armed and dangerous. The brother revealed that Manhard had allegedly kidnapped his ex-girlfriend at gunpoint just the day before and had stolen her car. But the immediate crisis was that Manhard was now at his brother's house and was trying to break in. As the brother spoke to the emergency dispatcher, he could see Manhard outside his home trying to force his way inside. Manhard was attempting to get through the front door. The brother didn't know what Joseph would do if he managed to get inside. Would he harm his family? Would he take more hostages? The brother's wife, also terrified by what was happening, whispered to the dispatcher that Manhard was walking around out front of their home, circling the property, looking for a way in. The dispatcher tried to reassure them, telling them that officers were on their way to their location. The dispatcher also informed them that they were bringing a K-9 unit because they really wanted to catch Manhard and apprehend him before he could hurt anyone or flee again. Responding officers from Clearfield Police Department received the dispatch and immediately headed to the location with lights and sirens. They arrived at the brothers' residence prepared for a dangerous confrontation with an armed suspect. The officers were carrying assault rifles as they approached the property because they had been informed that Manhard was armed with a handgun. Body camera footage captured by the responding officers shows them methodically and carefully clearing the house, moving room by room with weapons drawn, checking closets and any place someone could hide. They also searched a back shed on the property, looking for any sign of Manhard hiding or lying in wait. But despite their thorough search, he had already fled the scene by the time they arrived. Manhard had apparently seen or heard the police vehicles approaching and had run off before they could surround the property and trap him. The police searched the surrounding area on foot and in vehicles but could not locate him. He had vanished into the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the legal system was moving quickly to bring Manhard to justice for his crimes. Based on the kidnapping and robbery of his ex-girlfriend the previous day, prosecutors filed formal charges in 2nd District Court. Manhard was formally charged with aggravated robbery, a first-degree felony that carries a potential sentence of 5 years to life in prison. He was also charged with aggravated kidnapping, another first-degree felony with similar sentencing implications. Additionally, he was charged with controlling an unauthorized vehicle, which is the legal term for auto theft or joyriding when the vehicle is taken by force or fraud. A warrant was issued for his arrest with a special provision: no bail. This meant that if Manhard was captured and brought into custody, he would be held in jail without any possibility of posting bail and being released. Judges issue no bail warrants only in cases where the defendant is considered extremely dangerous to the community or is a severe flight risk. Manhard qualified on both counts. He was considered armed and extremely dangerous by all law enforcement agencies searching for him. Later that same afternoon on the 9th of September, police received another report that Manhard had been spotted outside a different residence in Clearfield. Officers were immediately notified and rushed to the location, hoping to finally apprehend him. But once again, by the time the police officers arrived on scene and set up their perimeter, Manhard had already vanished. He was proving to be elusive and difficult to capture, moving quickly through the area, staying mobile, and managing to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Police theorized that he might have had help from friends or associates who were sheltering him or providing him with transportation, though this was never confirmed. As the day turned to evening and then to night, police continued actively searching for Manhard, checking known associate addresses, conducting patrols in areas where he had been spotted, and following up on tips from the public. They knew he was armed, dangerous, increasingly desperate, and high on drugs. They had no idea that the situation was about to escalate dramatically into a multi-jurisdiction chase and eventually a hostage crisis. Around 1:30 in the morning on the 10th of September, now well past midnight and into the early morning hours, Manhard made the decision to return to the same Clearfield residence where he had been spotted the previous afternoon. Perhaps he thought the police would no longer be watching it. Perhaps he needed something from that location. Perhaps in his drug-impaired state, he wasn't thinking clearly. Whatever his reasoning, it proved to be a critical mistake. This time, police officers were positioned nearby and were able to respond quickly. Responding officers spotted Manhard at the residence and immediately attempted to approach and apprehend him. Manhard saw the police coming and immediately fled on foot, running through the streets of Clearfield at full speed. Officers pursued him on foot and in vehicles. Manhard was younger and faster than many of the officers chasing him, and he had the advantage of being able to cut through yards and alleys where police vehicles couldn't follow. He made his way to the Freeport Center, a large commercial and industrial complex with numerous warehouses, loading docks, and manufacturing facilities. It's the kind of sprawling property with multiple buildings and hiding spots where someone fleeing on foot could easily evade pursuers, at least temporarily. Police officers pursued Manhard into the Freeport Center complex, but in the maze of buildings, loading bays, parked trucks, and industrial equipment, he managed to elude them once again. Officers spread out and searched the area methodically, checking behind buildings and in alcoves. They eventually found Manhard's vehicle abandoned somewhere in the Freeport Center parking areas, but Manhard himself was nowhere to be found. He had escaped on foot and disappeared into the darkness. While police were still on scene at the Freeport Center investigating the abandoned vehicle and continuing to search for Manhard, approximately 10 minutes after he had fled from them, emergency dispatchers received another frantic call. This call came from an employee at Utility Trailer Manufacturing Company, a business located about a quarter-mile away from where Manhard had abandoned his vehicle at the Freeport Center. The caller's voice was filled with shock and urgency as she reported that a woman had just walked through their front door in an absolute state of hysteria and panic. The woman was saying that her car had been stolen and that she had been shot at. Most alarmingly, the woman was covered in blood. The caller, clearly shaken herself, told dispatch that she didn't want to leave the victim's side because she didn't know how badly the woman was injured. She was terrified that the woman might be bleeding out right there in their office and expressed her fear that the victim might die before medical help could arrive. What had actually happened was that Manhard, after fleeing on foot from the Freeport Center and evading police in the darkness, had come across this woman in a parking area near her workplace at Utility Trailer Manufacturing Company. She was likely either arriving for an early morning shift or leaving from a night shift. Manhard approached her vehicle suddenly and aggressively. He produced his handgun and pointed it at her, demanding that she hand over her car keys and get out of the vehicle. This was a carjacking, a violent felony where someone takes a vehicle from another person by force or threat of force. The woman, terrified but perhaps not fully processing what was happening, initially refused to comply or tried to resist in some way. This resistance enraged Manhard. He fired a single round from his handgun through her car window at close range. The bullet struck the window, shattering it completely. Broken glass exploded inward, showering the woman with sharp fragments. Miraculously, the bullet itself didn't strike her body, passing through the window space without hitting her. However, the shattered glass cut her in multiple places, and she was bleeding from these cuts. This is why she appeared to be covered in blood when she ran into her workplace seeking help, and why witnesses initially thought she had been shot. The woman, now fully understanding the mortal danger she was in, and that this man was willing to kill her, immediately got out of the vehicle as Manhard demanded. She ran toward the safety of her workplace building as fast as she could. Manhard immediately jumped into the driver's seat of her car and sped away, tires squealing as he fled the scene. He now had a new vehicle that police weren't yet looking for, giving him another opportunity to escape. The woman reached the safety of the building and collapsed, going into shock from the traumatic experience she had just endured. Her co-workers called for emergency medical services and police while trying to comfort her and assess her injuries. Police now had a description of a new stolen vehicle to search for, and Manhard had just added another serious felony to his rapidly growing list of charges: carjacking with a firearm and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Officers flooded the surrounding area searching for the newly stolen vehicle, putting out an all-points bulletin with the vehicle description, license plate number, and warning that the driver was armed and had already demonstrated willingness to shoot at people. It didn't take long before an alert officer spotted the stolen vehicle traveling in the area of 800 North Main Street in Clearfield. The officer attempted to conduct a traffic stop, activating his emergency lights and siren and positioning his vehicle to pull Manhard over. But Manhard had absolutely no intention of surrendering to police. He knew that he was facing multiple first-degree felonies and would be spending many years, possibly decades, in prison if captured. He pressed down hard on the accelerator, and the chase was on. The high-speed pursuit began through the streets of Clearfield in the early morning hours. Manhard drove recklessly and dangerously, running red lights, speeding through intersections, and weaving around other vehicles on the road. During this pursuit through city streets, Manhard drove so recklessly and aggressively that he actually forced one police vehicle completely off the road. He swerved his vehicle directly at the police car in what could have been a deadly collision, forcing the officer to take evasive action and drive off the roadway to avoid being hit. Manhard was now using his vehicle as a weapon against law enforcement officers who were simply trying to apprehend him and stop his violent rampage. This action constituted yet another serious felony: aggravated assault on a police officer. The high-speed chase continued as Manhard made his way onto Interstate 15, one of Utah's major north-south highways that runs through the densely populated Wasatch Front Corridor. Interstate 15 is a busy highway, even in the early morning hours, with commercial trucks and commuters traveling at highway speeds. A high-speed chase on this roadway posed enormous danger, not just to the officers pursuing Manhard, but to every innocent motorist on the highway. Now, Utah Highway Patrol troopers joined the pursuit, their vehicles equipped for high-speed chases on highways. Deputies from the Davis County Sheriff's Office also joined the growing convoy of law enforcement vehicles pursuing Manhard. Multiple agencies were now coordinating their efforts through radio communications, trying to stop this increasingly dangerous fugitive before he caused a catastrophic accident or killed someone. The chase reached extremely high speeds as Manhard weaved through traffic on the interstate, cutting between lanes, passing vehicles on the shoulder, and driving with complete disregard for his own safety or the safety of others. Police supervisors monitoring the chase had to make difficult decisions about whether to continue the pursuit, given the danger to the public. But Manhard had already shown he was willing to shoot at people and take hostages, so letting him escape wasn't really an option either. The decision was made to deploy spike strips, a tire deflation device that law enforcement uses to end vehicle pursuits. These are specially designed strips with hollow spikes that puncture vehicle tires and cause them to deflate rapidly without causing a sudden blowout that might make the vehicle uncontrollable. Officers ahead of Manhard's position set up the spike strips across his lane of travel. As Manhard's stolen vehicle approached at high speed, he either didn't see the strips in time or couldn't avoid them. His vehicle rolled over the spike strips, and the specially designed hollow spikes punctured multiple tires on the car. Air began rushing out of the punctured tires immediately. At first, Manhard was able to continue driving on the deflating tires, but as the tires lost more and more air pressure, they began to shred and come apart. Pieces of rubber flew off the disintegrating tires. The vehicle became increasingly difficult to control. Eventually, near Shepherd Lane, the stolen car became completely inoperable. The tires were destroyed down to the bare rims, and the vehicle could no longer be driven. But even with his escape vehicle disabled, Manhard was not done running. Rather than finally surrender to the numerous police officers who were converging on his position, he made another desperate decision. He abandoned the disabled vehicle in the middle of the highway and fled on foot once again. This time, in an extraordinarily dangerous move, he ran directly across the active lanes of Interstate 15. Traffic was still moving at highway speeds, and Manhard was running across multiple lanes of traffic in the darkness of early morning. This maneuver could easily have resulted in his death, struck by a vehicle traveling at 60 or 70 miles per hour. It could also have caused a massive pileup as drivers swerved to avoid hitting him. Somehow, miraculously, Manhard made it across all the lanes of the interstate without being struck. He reached the opposite side and ran into a residential neighborhood in Farmington, a city adjacent to Clearfield. Police officers, now on foot themselves, pursued him into the neighborhood. More officers arrived and they established a perimeter around the area where Manhard had been last seen, trying to contain him and prevent him from escaping the net closing around him. K-9 units were deployed, specially trained police dogs that can track a person's scent and locate suspects hiding in buildings, crawl spaces, or outdoor areas. SWAT teams and tactical units from multiple agencies began converging on the location, understanding that this was now a manhunt for an armed and extremely dangerous fugitive who had shown he would shoot at police and civilians. The sun was beginning to rise over the Wasatch Mountains to the east, and residents in this quiet Farmington neighborhood were waking up to discover that their normally peaceful streets were filled with police vehicles from multiple agencies, officers with rifles drawn taking up tactical positions, and a helicopter circling overhead. As the systematic search intensified with officers moving methodically through the neighborhood checking yards, garages, and any place a person could hide, Manhard was desperately looking for a place to hide or a way to escape the tightening perimeter around him. He knew the police were closing in and that he was running out of options. At one point during his panicked flight through the neighborhood, Manhard approached a house and tried to gain entry by force. He was looking for a place to hide or possibly to take hostages who could be used as bargaining chips with police. He fired a single shot from his handgun at the large front window to the side of the front door, hoping the gunshot would shatter the window and allow him to reach through and unlock the door or simply climb through. The bullet struck the glass and left a visible bullet hole, but the window was apparently made of strong tempered glass or laminated safety glass because it didn't completely shatter the way ordinary window glass would. The glass spiderwebbed and cracked from the impact point but held together enough that Manhard couldn't break through and get inside the house. Fortunately, the residents inside that home were not injured by the gunshot. The bullet didn't fully penetrate into the house, and the family inside was able to call police and report the shooting. Manhard, unable to get into that house, moved on and continued looking for another way to evade capture. He soon came upon another house on Tuscany Grove Circle in Farmington. The specific address was 1645 South Tuscany Grove Circle. This home appeared quiet in the early morning hours. Most of the residents in the neighborhood were either still asleep or just beginning to wake up for the day. As Manhard circled the property looking for a way in, checking windows and doors, he discovered an open basement window. Someone in the house had left a basement window open, perhaps for ventilation, or perhaps they had simply forgotten to close and lock it. The window was just large enough for a person to squeeze through if they tried. Manhard, seeing this opportunity, didn't hesitate. He climbed through the window and dropped down into the basement of the home. He was now inside, hidden from the police who were searching outside, and he had access to potential hostages. The family who lived at this address had absolutely no connection to Joseph Manhard whatsoever. They didn't know him. He didn't know them. They had never met. They had no mutual friends or acquaintances. Manhard had never been to this house before. His choice of this particular house was entirely random, driven purely by circumstance and opportunity. This family simply had the terrible misfortune of living in the neighborhood where Manhard happened to be fleeing, and they had the additional misfortune of having an accessible window in their home at the exact moment a desperate, armed, drug-addicted fugitive was looking for a place to hide. Their lives were about to be turned upside down through absolutely no fault of their own. Inside the home at the time Manhard entered were 5 people. The household consisted of a father, a mother, 2 daughters with one of them being a juvenile minor, and the boyfriend of one of the adult daughters. They were sleeping or just beginning their morning routines when Manhard entered their basement. The family became aware that someone was in their house, likely hearing the noise of Manhard climbing through the window or moving around in the basement. As the terrifying realization set in that there was an intruder in their home, panic began to spread through the household. One of the daughters, the juvenile minor, showed incredible presence of mind, quick thinking, and courage in that moment of crisis. Rather than freezing in fear or waiting to see what would happen, she immediately made the decision to escape. She ran to a basement window, opened it, and climbed out, dropping to the ground outside. She then ran as fast as she could away from the house to safety. Her quick action in those first crucial moments likely saved her life. Shortly after the daughter escaped through the basement window, in a bizarre and difficult-to-explain twist of events, Manhard made a decision to let the father of the family leave the house. According to later reports and statements from the family members, Manhard told the father that he could leave so he could go to work. This is a strange detail that doesn't have an obvious explanation. Perhaps Manhard was trying to appear reasonable, or was attempting to show that he wasn't there to hurt anyone. Perhaps he thought that letting some hostages go would make him seem more sympathetic to police negotiators when they inevitably arrived. Perhaps in his drug-impaired state, he simply wasn't thinking logically and was making random decisions that didn't make rational sense. Or perhaps he calculated that having fewer people to control would be easier for him to manage. Whatever his reasoning, the father was allowed to walk out of the house unharmed. Both the daughter who had escaped through the basement window and the father who had been released immediately contacted police once they were safely away from the house and out of Manhard's sight and control. Law enforcement officers were already saturating the entire area in a grid search pattern looking for Manhard, so they were able to respond immediately when the family members made contact and directed them to the specific house on Tuscany Grove Circle. The officers now knew exactly where Manhard was located, which house he had entered, and that he was no longer alone. The situation had transformed from a manhunt for a fleeing suspect into a barricaded hostage situation, one of the most dangerous and complex scenarios in law enforcement. Still being held at gunpoint inside the house were 3 innocent people: the mother of the family, her other daughter, and the daughter's boyfriend. Their lives were now in the hands of an armed stranger who was high on drugs, wanted for multiple violent felonies, and facing life in prison if captured. Police quickly surrounded the home, establishing a secure perimeter around the property in all directions. Officers took up tactical positions behind cover, using vehicles, trees, and other structures to shield themselves while maintaining clear lines of sight to the house. They ensured that Manhard couldn't escape out any exit without being seen, and they positioned themselves so they couldn't be easily targeted if Manhard started shooting. Multiple agencies were now on scene, including Farmington Police Department, Clearfield Police Department, Davis County Sheriff's Office, Utah Highway Patrol, and others. Commanders from these various agencies set up a command post where they could coordinate their response. SWAT teams from neighboring jurisdictions were called in to assist. Among these responding tactical units was the highly trained and experienced SWAT team from Salt Lake City Police Department. Salt Lake City's SWAT team is considered one of the premier tactical units in Utah, with extensive training in hostage rescue operations, close quarters combat, and precision marksmanship. The team included specialized marksmen, often called snipers or precision riflemen, who are trained to make extremely accurate long-distance shots in high-pressure situations where innocent lives are at stake. As the situation developed and more resources arrived on scene, the impact began rippling through the community. 2 elementary schools in the Davis School District, concerned about the armed standoff happening in close proximity to their campuses and not knowing if or when the situation might spread to other locations, made the decision to implement delayed start times that morning. Instead of beginning the normal school day at the usual time, administrators notified parents that students should not arrive until 10:30 in the morning. This gave law enforcement several additional hours to resolve the situation before children would be present in the area. Parents throughout Farmington were alerted through emergency notification systems that a dangerous situation involving an armed suspect and hostages was unfolding in their community, and that police were actively working to resolve it. Residents were told to stay inside their homes, lock their doors, and avoid the area around Tuscany Grove Circle. Hostage negotiators were brought to the scene. These are specially trained law enforcement officers who have received extensive education and practice in crisis communication, psychology, and de-escalation techniques. Their job is extraordinarily difficult and requires a unique skill set. They must build rapport and trust with someone who is often in the midst of a mental health crisis, frightened, angry, desperate, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They must try to calm the person down, make them believe that giving up peacefully is their best and only real option, work to establish a connection that makes the person less likely to harm hostages, and most importantly, they must keep the hostages safe while working toward a peaceful resolution. The negotiators made contact with Manhard, likely through a telephone in the house, and began what would become an hours-long conversation attempting to convince him to release the hostages and surrender. Inside the house, the 3 remaining hostages were experiencing unimaginable terror. They were being held at gunpoint by a complete stranger who had violently invaded their home. They had no idea what he wanted from them, how long this would last, whether he would hurt them, or whether they would survive. They couldn't leave, couldn't call for help, and were completely at the mercy of this armed man. As the morning progressed and the negotiations continued outside, the family members witnessed increasingly disturbing and frightening behavior from Manhard. He pulled out what appeared to be aluminum foil and drugs from his pockets. The hostages watched as he prepared the drugs, placing them on the foil and then heating the foil from below with a lighter. As the drugs heated up, they vaporized and Manhard inhaled the vapors. This is a common method of smoking heroin known as chasing the dragon. The hostages reported that Joseph would repeatedly smoke something off the tinfoil while in the home, doing this multiple times over the course of the hours they were held captive. They could observe that he was getting high, that the drugs were affecting his behavior and mental state. His behavior became more erratic and unpredictable. His speech patterns changed, sometimes becoming slurred or rambling. He appeared to be increasingly intoxicated and disconnected from reality as the hours passed and he continued using drugs. This made the situation even more dangerous because someone who is high on heroin may not think rationally, may have delayed reactions, may become suddenly violent, or may make impulsive decisions that wouldn't make sense to a sober person. The negotiators working outside continued their conversations with Manhard over the phone, trying to understand his mindset, his demands if he had any, and what it would take to convince him to end this peacefully. What they learned from these conversations was deeply troubling and suggested that this situation might not end without violence. Manhard told the negotiators that he was going to end it all and that he just needed to tie up loose ends. This language about ending it all indicated he was seriously considering suicide. People in crisis who talk about ending it all are at high risk of harming themselves or engaging in what law enforcement calls suicide by cop, where a person intentionally provokes police into shooting them because they want to die but can't bring themselves to do it directly. Manhard oscillated between different potential courses of action as he talked to negotiators. At some points in the conversation, he talked seriously about killing himself, describing it as his only way out. At other times, he talked about somehow escaping from the house and fleeing to Mexico, as if he could outrun all the law enforcement agencies now surrounding him and make it across an international border. His thinking wasn't logical or coherent, likely due to the combination of stress, fear, exhaustion, and the drugs he was continuously using. The negotiators also facilitated a phone call between Manhard and his brother, hoping that hearing a family member's voice, someone who cared about him and knew him well, might help de-escalate the situation and make him more willing to surrender peacefully. Family members can sometimes reach someone in crisis in ways that strangers cannot. During that conversation with his brother, Manhard was heard stating that he saw only 2 options ahead of him, either committing suicide or somehow managing to flee to Mexico. He seemed to understand at some level that going to prison for his extensive list of violent crimes was inevitable if he was taken into custody alive. He had kidnapped people, stolen cars, shot at people, assaulted police officers, and was now holding 3 innocent people hostage. He was looking at potentially spending the rest of his life in prison. To someone in his desperate and drug-addled state of mind, death or flight seemed like the only alternatives to that fate. Most chilling of all the things Manhard said during the negotiations, he made direct and explicit threats about what would happen if police tried to end the standoff by force. He stated clearly and unambiguously that if police officers came into the house to try to rescue the hostages, he would put his gun to one of the hostages' heads and kill them. This was not an idle threat or bluffing to buy himself more time. Manhard had already demonstrated repeatedly over the past 2 days that he was willing to use deadly violence. He had kidnapped his ex-girlfriend at gunpoint and terrorized her. He had fired a gun at a woman during a carjacking, shattering her window with her still in the car. He had shot at a house trying to break in. He had engaged in high-speed chases through city streets and on the interstate, endangering countless innocent drivers. He had tried to run police officers off the road with his vehicle. There was every reason to believe that he would absolutely follow through on his threat to execute the hostages if police made entry into the house. The negotiators took this threat seriously, as did the tactical commanders planning potential rescue scenarios. As Manhard continued to smoke heroin throughout the morning, the drugs began to have their inevitable effect on his body. Heroin is a central nervous system depressant, and one of its primary effects is sedation. Users often experience what's called nodding, where they drift in and out of consciousness, their head drooping forward and then jerking back up as they briefly awaken. Manhard began displaying this behavior. At one point, he was sitting on a couch with the 3 hostages nearby, and he began to nod off as the drugs caused him to struggle to stay awake and alert. His head drooped forward and his grip on his weapon loosened slightly as consciousness began slipping away from him. One of the hostages, a young woman who had been watching him carefully and waiting for any opportunity, saw this moment as possibly her only chance to save herself and the other hostages. She made a split-second decision that required incredible courage. She reached out and grabbed hold of Manhard's Glock handgun, trying to wrestle it away from him before he could fully react. Her plan, as she later told investigators, was to shoot him in the leg. She wasn't trying to kill him, just to wound him enough that he would be incapacitated and unable to hurt them, and then they could escape or call for help. She managed to get control of the gun for a brief moment and fired a single shot aiming at his leg. But in the chaos and confusion of the moment, with adrenaline flooding her system and her hands shaking, the shot missed its target. The bullet didn't strike Manhard. The sound of the gunshot inside the house jolted Manhard back to full alertness immediately. The drugs wearing off in an instant as his survival instincts kicked in, he realized what had happened and that one of his hostages had just tried to shoot him. He immediately began to attack her with savage and brutal violence. Manhard punched the woman repeatedly in the face with his fists, hitting her multiple times. He struck her arms as she tried to defend herself and maintain control of the weapon. She fought back desperately, understanding that her life and the lives of the other 2 hostages now depended entirely on whether she could get control of that gun. They fell from the couch to the floor, grappling and fighting for the weapon. She was fighting for her life, but Manhard was stronger, more desperate, and was fighting with the strength that drugs and adrenaline can provide. He managed to wrench the gun away from her, regaining control of his weapon. The woman, realizing that she had failed in her attempt to disarm him, and that Manhard was now even more dangerous and enraged than he had been before, made another split-second decision to try to get away from him and put some barrier between them. She crawled as quickly as she could across the floor toward a nearby bathroom that was just a few feet away. If she could get inside and lock the door, maybe she would be safe for at least a few moments. She made it to the bathroom and turned to shut the door behind her. As she was pulling the door closed, Manhard, now back in full control of his gun and absolutely furious that she had tried to kill him, pointed the weapon directly at her from just feet away. He pulled the trigger. At that range, with the gun pointed directly at her, the bullet should have struck her center mass. She should have been shot, and given the caliber and the close range, the wound would likely have been fatal or caused catastrophic injury. But for some inexplicable reason that no one has been able to fully explain, the gun didn't discharge. The weapon failed to fire. Perhaps there was a mechanical malfunction in the firing mechanism. Perhaps the ammunition was faulty. Perhaps in the struggle, something had happened to the gun that caused it to jam or misfire. Perhaps, as some of the family members later said, it was divine intervention or a miracle. Whatever the technical or supernatural reason, the gun did not fire when Manhard pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The woman, realizing she had just survived what should have been her execution by pure chance, slammed the bathroom door shut and likely collapsed in shock and terror, understanding how close she had just come to death. But Manhard wasn't going to let her hide in the bathroom and feel safe. He needed to maintain control over all of his hostages, and he couldn't have one of them barricaded in another room. He immediately pointed his gun at one of the other hostages, specifically at the daughter's boyfriend who was still in the main room. He shouted to the woman in the bathroom that she needed to come out right now, or he would shoot the other hostage. He was threatening to kill the boyfriend if she didn't come out. The woman in the bathroom was faced with an impossible choice. She could stay in the bathroom where she had a locked door between herself and Manhard, but that meant the other hostage would die. Or she could open the door and come back out, putting herself back in immediate danger, but potentially saving the other hostage's life. She made the decision to open the bathroom door and come out. She sat back down on the couch, her face bruised and swelling from where Manhard had punched her repeatedly, her body shaking with adrenaline and fear, knowing that she had tried her best to save everyone and had failed. The hours continued to pass with the 3 hostages still trapped in their own home with this armed, violent, drug-addicted stranger. The sun rose higher in the sky. Outside, dozens of law enforcement officers maintained their positions around the house. SWAT snipers were positioned at strategic locations where they had clear lines of sight to various windows and doors of the house. These precision marksmen were lying prone with their rifles, peering through high-powered scopes, waiting for any opportunity to take a shot if it became necessary. They could see movement inside the house occasionally through windows. They were in communication with the command post, reporting what they could observe and receiving updates on the negotiation process. Police commanders reviewing the situation and all the intelligence they had gathered about Manhard's behavior, his statements, his visible drug use, his explicit threats to kill hostages if police entered, and his demonstrated capacity for violence throughout this entire incident, made a critical tactical decision. They raised the threat level designation to what is called in law enforcement tactical operations, target of opportunity, and open authority. These are among the highest threat level classifications that can be issued in a hostage or barricaded suspect situation. The designation means that the person who is the subject of the operation has met the threshold for tactical operators to stop the threat by any means necessary if the suspect presents himself as a viable target. The authorization stated explicitly that even if the SWAT operators were not able to see the weapon in Manhard's hands at the moment they had a shot opportunity, there was enough intelligence that had been gathered during the standoff that proved the suspect had the imminent means and the clear intention to do serious bodily harm or to kill the hostages. In practical terms, this authorization meant that if a SWAT marksman had a clear shot at Manhard and he exposed himself enough to provide a viable target, the marksman was authorized to take that shot without waiting for additional commands from supervisors. The decision to use lethal force had been pre-authorized by the incident commanders. This is not a decision that is made lightly. It represents a determination that the risk to the hostages has become so severe and so imminent that waiting for a perfect opportunity or continuing to negotiate has become more dangerous than taking action. The SWAT snipers understood their authorization and took their positions with full knowledge that if Manhard gave them a clean shot, they were cleared to take it. The standoff was approaching the 7-hour mark. It was now mid-morning, and the 3 hostages had been held at gunpoint in their own home for nearly 7 hours of absolute terror. Outside, parents were beginning to arrive at the elementary schools with their children for the delayed 10:30 start time. The neighborhood was still locked down with police everywhere. Media helicopters were circling overhead filming the scene. News reporters were broadcasting live updates about the ongoing hostage situation. As the negotiations continued, the negotiators made what appeared to be a significant breakthrough in their communication with Manhard. They convinced him to come to the front door of the home with the 3 hostages. The stated purpose of this request was for Manhard to show police that the hostages were unharmed and were being treated well. This is a common negotiation tactic in hostage situations. Getting the suspect to show the hostages alive serves several purposes. First, it confirms to police that the hostages are indeed still alive and allows officers to visually assess their condition and look for any signs of injury. Second, it can sometimes lead to the suspect releasing 1 or more hostages as a gesture of good faith. Third, it can provide tactical opportunities if the suspect exposes himself. The negotiators hoped that this might be a first step toward a peaceful resolution, that maybe Manhard would see all the police presence and realize that escape was impossible and that his best option was to surrender. However, Manhard made it explicitly and abundantly clear that he was not surrendering. He agreed to come to the door and show the hostages to prove they were alive and unharmed, but that was the full extent of what he was agreeing to do. He was not giving up. He was not coming out with his hands up. He was not releasing the hostages. This was merely a demonstration that he was still in control of the situation and that the hostages were alive. Just after 9 o'clock in the morning, approximately 9:07 based on official police timestamps, nearly 7 hours after the standoff had begun when Manhard first entered the house, movement was detected at the front door of the residence. Officers watching the house saw the door begin to open. Manhard and the 3 hostages were approaching the door from inside the house, moving toward it as he had agreed to do during negotiations. The front door opened slightly, just a few inches. Initially, Manhard stayed concealed behind the door itself, using the solid wood door as cover and remaining mostly hidden from any potential police snipers who he correctly assumed were positioned somewhere outside with rifles aimed at the house. He was cautious and careful, not wanting to expose himself to being shot. He kept himself back in the shadows and darkness of the house's interior, staying out of direct line of sight from outside. From his protected position behind the door, he peered outside carefully, moving his head just enough to see out, but trying to keep most of his body concealed. As he looked outside and scanned the area immediately visible to him, he didn't see any police officers in his direct and immediate line of sight. The police had positioned themselves tactically and strategically, taking cover behind vehicles and structures, spread out around the property at various angles and distances. From Manhard's limited view behind the door, looking straight ahead, he couldn't see the officers who were there. Thinking perhaps that the police were positioned farther back than they actually were, or perhaps emboldened by not seeing anyone directly in front of him, or perhaps just wanting to get a better view of the police deployment around the house, Manhard became less cautious. He leaned forward and peered further into the doorway, stepping forward slightly and exposing more of his head, shoulders, and upper body. He wanted to look around and see where exactly all the police officers were positioned. He exposed himself further, moving beyond the protection of the doorframe, leaning out to get a better view of the area around his position. At that precise moment, a SWAT marksman with the Salt Lake City Police Department, who had been lying in position with Manhard in his rifle scope, patiently waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, made the split-second decision to fire. The marksman had been watching through his high-powered optic, his crosshairs trained on the doorway, waiting for a clear shot, waiting for Manhard to expose himself enough to guarantee a hit to a vital area. When Manhard leaned into the doorway and exposed his head and upper body, that moment had finally arrived. The sniper's training kicked in. He controlled his breathing, steadied his aim, accounted for distance and any wind, and pressed the trigger slowly and deliberately. The rifle fired a single shot. The bullet traveled through the air across the distance between the sniper's position and the doorway and struck Manhard in the head. It was an instantly fatal shot. Manhard's body dropped where he stood. He was dead before he hit the ground. The three hostages, who had been standing near Manhard just inside the doorway as he had positioned them to show police they were alive, suddenly heard the gunshot and saw Manhard collapse. Tactical officers who had been staged nearby in positions ready to make entry rushed forward immediately. They burst through the doorway, weapons raised and ready. They grabbed the three hostages, physically pulling them away from Manhard's body and out of the house, hustling them toward safety behind the police perimeter. The hostages were rushed away from the scene, their ordeal finally over. They were evaluated by emergency medical personnel, who checked them for injuries and treated the woman who had been beaten by Manhard when she tried to grab his gun. The hostage situation was over. Police officers flooded into the house, securing each room, making sure there were no other threats, and beginning to process what was now a fatal officer-involved shooting scene, as well as a crime scene for all of Manhard's actions inside the house. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene where Manhard's body lay. Although it was immediately clear to anyone who saw him that Manhard had been killed instantly by the headshot and that there was no possibility of resuscitation, protocol and procedure required that medical professionals make the official assessment. Paramedics checked for vital signs and found none. Manhard was declared deceased at the scene. However, because of legal requirements and procedures in officer-involved shootings, his body was transported by medical helicopter to an area hospital where a physician could officially pronounce him dead and where an autopsy could eventually be performed. The flight was a formality, as there was no chance of survival from the type of wound he had sustained. At the hospital, a physician officially pronounced Joseph Anthony Manhard dead. No law enforcement officers were injured during the entire incident, from the initial chase through the hostage standoff to the final shooting. More importantly to everyone involved, none of the three hostages who had been held captive for nearly 7 hours had been killed or shot, though they were certainly traumatized by the experience, and the woman who had tried to disarm Manhard was bruised and battered from being beaten. In the aftermath, as is absolutely standard procedure in any officer-involved shooting regardless of circumstances, multiple separate investigations were immediately launched. The Salt Lake City Police Department's Internal Affairs Division opened an investigation to determine whether their officer who fired the fatal shot had followed all proper protocols, whether the use of force was consistent with department policy, whether the officer had properly documented his actions, and whether any policy violations had occurred. The Davis County Attorney's Office, acting as an independent outside agency, opened its own investigation to determine whether the use of deadly force was legally justified under Utah state law. The FBI and other federal agencies also reviewed the incident as they do with many officer-involved shootings. These investigations would take weeks or months to complete, as every piece of evidence was reviewed, every witness was interviewed, and every action was analyzed. One issue that immediately arose and became a point of significant discussion and controversy was the fact that neither the sniper who fired the fatal shot nor his spotter, the second SWAT team member who works with the sniper to help identify targets and assess conditions, had activated their body cameras during the incident. Modern police departments across the United States have increasingly adopted body-worn camera programs where officers wear small cameras on their uniforms that record their actions and interactions with the public. These cameras have been promoted as a tool for transparency and accountability, allowing the public and investigators to see exactly what officers saw and did during critical incidents. Most police departments have policies requiring officers to activate their body cameras during any law enforcement action. The failure of both the sniper and spotter to have their cameras activated was a violation of the Salt Lake City Police Department's body camera policy. This violation sparked a significant debate in law enforcement circles, among civil rights advocates, and in the general public. Some law enforcement experts, policy advocates, and community members argued that the officers should face disciplinary action for violating the clearly stated body camera policy. They argued that policies exist for a reason and that exceptions can't be made based on the outcome of the situation. If officers can decide when to follow policies and when to ignore them, the policies become meaningless. Others within law enforcement and some outside experts argued that the body camera policy needed to be amended or clarified to account for specialized tactical situations. They pointed out that SWAT snipers operate in very specific conditions that are quite different from patrol officers or even most other SWAT team members. Snipers often remain in concealed positions where they must stay completely still and silent for extended periods, sometimes hours. They are typically in prone positions looking through rifle scopes, in positions and wearing equipment that may not be conducive to wearing body cameras that would capture useful footage. Some argued there should be a specific exception carved out in the policy for SWAT snipers in active shooting positions, or at minimum that the policy should be clarified about expectations for these specialized roles. Chris Bertram, a retired deputy chief of police who had extensive SWAT experience and who now worked as a law enforcement consultant providing expert analysis on police tactics and procedures, spoke publicly about this issue. He argued that as the law and policy were currently written and as they were being interpreted, the sniper in this case, who many people would rightfully consider a hero for saving the lives of 3 innocent hostages, could technically face disciplinary action ranging from a written reprimand to suspension or even termination for the policy violation. Bertram stated his belief that there probably needed to be a specific provision written into the department's body camera policy that addressed these exact types of tactical situations. He said that as he read the current policy, these officers were technically in violation of department policy by not having their cameras activated, and that was not what these heroic officers should be facing after successfully resolving an extremely dangerous hostage situation. The debate continued for some time, with valid points raised on multiple sides of the issue. Despite the controversy over the body camera policy violation, the more fundamental and important legal question was whether the shooting itself was justified under the law. The Davis County Attorney's Office conducted an exhaustive and thorough review of all available evidence. Investigators reviewed all witness statements from every person involved, including the 3 hostages who had been held captive, and could describe Manhard's behavior, threats, and actions during those 7 hours. They interviewed the police negotiators who had been on the phone with Manhard and could describe his statements about killing hostages if police entered and his talk about suicide. They reviewed all recorded phone conversations with Manhard that had been preserved as part of the negotiation process. They examined the physical evidence from inside the house, including the damage from the earlier struggle when the hostage tried to grab his gun. They reviewed tactical logs and radio communications from all the agencies on scene. They brought in use-of-force experts to analyze whether the sniper's decision to fire was reasonable, given the totality of circumstances known at that moment. After this comprehensive review that took several months to complete, Davis County Attorney Troy Rawlings issued his official decision in December of 2021, approximately 3 months after the September incident. Rawlings issued a detailed report explaining his findings and conclusions. He found and declared publicly that the officer who fired the fatal shot was legally justified in his use of deadly force. The decision came down to several key factors. First, Manhard had made explicit threats during negotiations that he would kill the hostages if police entered the house. Second, Manhard had demonstrated throughout the preceding 48 hours that he was absolutely willing to use deadly force, having shot at multiple people, engaged in carjackings at gunpoint, and fired at a house. Third, he had been using drugs throughout the hostage situation and was not in a rational state of mind. Fourth, one of the hostages had already tried to shoot him, and he had violently beaten her in response, showing his capacity for immediate violence against the hostages. Fifth, when he appeared at the doorway, He was in a position where he could immediately turn and shoot the hostages who were right behind him before any officers could stop him. Sixth, the target of opportunity and open authority designations had been properly authorized by command staff based on the imminent threat to the hostages. Given all these factors combined, Rawlings determined that the officer had reasonable belief that Manhard posed an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the 3 hostages, and that the use of deadly force was the only way to stop that threat and save innocent lives. Salt Lake City Police Chief Mike Brown issued a strong public statement supporting his officer who had fired the shot. Chief Brown's statement emphasized the difficult position officers are placed in during these critical incidents. He stated that their officer had made an extraordinarily difficult decision, relying on his extensive training and his experience as a SWAT operator in a literal fraction of a second to save the lives of 3 innocent people who were being held hostage by a complete stranger who had terrorized them for hours. Chief Brown emphasized that there was no other way to characterize the officer's actions except to call them heroic. He stated that the officer was a dedicated public servant and that he was proud that this officer was among the ranks of the Salt Lake City Police Department. He thanked Davis County District Attorney Rawlings personally and thanked all of the investigating detectives who had conducted such a comprehensive review of the case. His statement made clear that the department stood fully behind the officer's decision and actions. The family who had been held hostage for those terrible 7 hours also spoke out publicly in the days and weeks after their ordeal finally ended. Their statements provide real insight into the absolute terror they had experienced and their profound gratitude toward all of the law enforcement officers who had worked to save them. The mother of the family, still processing the trauma of what she and her family had endured, wrote an emotional and heartfelt post on social media that was later widely shared by news outlets. She stated that she was addressing law enforcement officers with tears literally streaming down her face as she typed the words. She thanked them for their diligence, their patience, and their skill during what had seemed to her like an absolute eternity. 7 hours of being held at gunpoint in your own home by a violent stranger is an incomprehensibly long time. She wrote that the officers had saved their lives, pure and simple. She stated that there were no words adequate to express her sincere gratitude for the police officers, the SWAT teams, the negotiators, and everyone involved in resolving the situation. She said her family was blessed to be alive, and that they would be forever grateful. One of the daughters added her own statement to social media, saying that they were so grateful for the police, for the SWAT teams that had surrounded their house, and for the crisis hotline workers and negotiators who had worked for hours trying to end the situation peacefully. A fundraising campaign was quickly set up by friends and community members for the family to help them recover and rebuild from the incident. The family faced significant unexpected expenses resulting from what had happened. The campaign description detailed some of the extensive damage to their home that would need to be repaired before they could truly feel safe and comfortable living there again. There were multiple bullet holes in various walls and other surfaces inside the house from Manhard's gun. Windows had been broken, either during Manhard's initial forced entry or during the chaos of the hostage situation itself. Doors had been kicked down and damaged, either by Manhard as he rampaged through the house establishing control, or by police tactical teams when they made entry after the shooting to secure the scene and rescue the hostages. The house would need significant repairs to restore it to its previous condition. The fundraising campaign helped the family cover these repair costs and also helped with counseling expenses. Beyond the very visible physical damage to their home, there was the invisible psychological trauma. They had experienced one of the most terrifying ordeals imaginable. Being held hostage in their own home by a violent, armed, drug-addicted stranger for nearly 7 hours, watching him take drugs repeatedly, being explicitly threatened with death, witnessing the brave but failed attempt by one family member to disarm him and the brutal beating that followed, and finally hearing the gunshot that killed him right in their doorway. Processing this kind of trauma would take time and would almost certainly require professional counseling for multiple family members. The funds raised helped ensure they could access the mental health support they would need. The case drew extensive media attention throughout Utah and the surrounding region. Local television news outlets covered the story from beginning to end, starting with the initial manhunt for Manhard after he kidnapped his ex-girlfriend, through the car chases and the carjacking, into the hostage situation itself, with live coverage from helicopters showing the house surrounded by police, and finally the announcement that shots had been fired and that the suspect was dead, and hostages were safe. News conferences were held where police chiefs from the various agencies involved praised their officers and explained the timeline of events and the decisions that had been made throughout the incident. The chief of Farmington Police Department, Wayne Hansen, spoke about how random this was, how it could have been anyone's home, how this family had simply been in the wrong place when a desperate fugitive was looking for somewhere to hide. Residents of Farmington expressed shock and disbelief that such violence and terror had come to their normally quiet and safe neighborhood. Many expressed deep sympathy for the family who had been terrorized through absolutely no fault of their own, just terrible random chance. As more details emerged in the days, weeks, and months following the incident through police reports, court documents, and investigative findings, the full scope and scale of Joseph Manhard's crimes during those final 48 hours of his life became clear. In less than 2 full days from the morning of September 8th until the morning of September 10th, Manhard had committed an extraordinary number of serious violent felonies. He had kidnapped his ex-girlfriend at gunpoint and terrorized her. He had stolen her vehicle. He had terrorized his own family to the point that his brother called police begging for help and afraid for his life. He had evaded police capture multiple times. He had committed a carjacking, pointing a gun at a woman and demanding her vehicle. He had fired his gun at that woman when she initially resisted, shattering her car window and covering her with glass. He had led police on multiple high-speed chases through city streets and on the interstate, endangering every other driver on the road. He had attempted to run a police officer off the road with his vehicle, using the car as a weapon. He had run across an active interstate highway on foot, a suicidally dangerous act. He had fired his weapon at a house attempting to break in to take shelter or hostages. He had invaded a random home by breaking in through a basement window. He had held 3 innocent people hostage for nearly 7 continuous hours at gunpoint. He had repeatedly used heroin while holding these people captive. He had threatened explicitly to kill the hostages if police tried to rescue them. He had violently assaulted one hostage who tried to disarm him, beating her and punching her repeatedly in the face and arms. He had pulled the trigger attempting to shoot and kill that hostage at point-blank range, being prevented from murder only by a malfunction or misfire of his weapon. It was an absolutely extraordinary crime spree of violence, recklessness, and callous disregard for human life, all compressed into less than 48 hours and all driven by a toxic combination of drug addiction, desperation, and apparent mental instability or breakdown. The investigation also revealed more details about Manhard's background and personal history, providing some context for understanding, though certainly not excusing, what had led to this violent breaking point. He had been involved in what appeared to be a troubled and unhealthy romantic relationship. When that relationship ended on September 5th, just 3 days before his crime spree began, he apparently couldn't accept or process the breakup in a healthy way. His drug use, specifically his heroin addiction, had been escalating over the months leading up to these events. Heroin is an extremely addictive substance that fundamentally changes brain chemistry and decision-making capability. Chronic heroin users often engage in increasingly risky and desperate behaviors to obtain the drug and to avoid the severe physical withdrawal symptoms that occur when they stop using. Manhard's own family had become afraid of him in the days before the hostage situation, suggesting that his behavior had become increasingly erratic and threatening even to those who knew and presumably loved him. The combination of relationship trauma, escalating drug addiction, and whatever underlying psychological issues or mental health conditions he may have had created a perfect storm of factors that exploded into this sustained burst of violence. While understanding these contributing factors doesn't excuse his choices or his actions, it does provide some framework for understanding how a human being could devolve into such destructive and violent behavior in such a compressed period of time. For the 3 hostages who survived, particularly the young woman who had tried to grab his gun and had been beaten and nearly shot, life would never be quite the same as it was before. Even though they survived the ordeal physically unharmed aside from bruises and minor injuries, the psychological scars and trauma would take much longer to heal and might never fully disappear. The sense of safety and security that people feel in their own home, the place that should be the safest sanctuary in the world, had been completely and violently shattered. Every unexpected noise, every stranger approaching the house, every news story about a home invasion might trigger a flashback or panic response. The daughter who had shown such incredible courage in trying to grab Manhard's gun and disarm him might replay that moment in her mind thousands of times over the years, analyzing every microsecond, wondering what if she had succeeded, what if her aim had been better, what if the gun had actually fired when Manhard pulled the trigger at her, what if she had made different choices. Trauma from such an intense and prolonged life-threatening experience can manifest in countless ways, including recurring nightmares, severe anxiety, hypervigilance, and inability to relax, difficulty trusting other people, flashbacks triggered by sights or sounds or smells, and full post-traumatic stress disorder. The road to psychological recovery and healing would be long and difficult and would require professional help. For the police officers involved in the incident, particularly the SWAT sniper who had fired the fatal shot that ended Manhard's life, there would also be significant psychological and emotional impacts to process and work through. Taking another human being's life, even when it is clearly legally justified and morally necessary to save innocent lives, is never an easy thing for most police officers to live with. Despite what movies and television might suggest, the vast majority of police officers never fire their weapons at another person during their entire careers, and those who do are profoundly affected by it. Police departments provide mandatory counseling and psychological support services specifically for officers involved in shootings, precisely because of the known psychological toll these incidents take. The officer would have to live with the knowledge that he had killed someone, that he had ended a human life, even though he had done so to save 3 innocent people from certain death or serious harm. He would have to relive that moment countless times, during the multiple investigations and interviews, during the internal review process, during conversations with counselors, during debriefings with his SWAT team, and in his own mind late at night when trying to sleep. These are the hidden costs and burdens of police work that the general public rarely sees or fully appreciates. The case also reignited broader societal discussions about several important issues in law enforcement, public safety, and mental health. One significant discussion centered on policies and best practices for how law enforcement should handle barricaded suspects with hostages. Different police departments and jurisdictions across the country have different protocols and approaches. Some agencies favor extended negotiation periods, operating under the philosophy that time is generally on the side of law enforcement and that patient, skilled negotiation can resolve most hostage situations peacefully without anyone getting hurt. The longer negotiations continue, this thinking goes, the more tired and less aggressive the suspect becomes, the more rapport negotiators can build, and the more likely a peaceful surrender becomes. Other agencies and tactical experts favor more aggressive tactical interventions when there is clear evidence that hostages are in imminent danger, arguing that waiting too long can result in hostages being killed and that swift action is sometimes necessary. In this particular case, police had tried negotiations for nearly 7 full hours before the shooting occurred, suggesting they had genuinely exhausted the negotiation option, and that the threat level had escalated to the point where immediate tactical action had become necessary to save lives. Another discussion that this case brought into focus centered on the role of drug addiction in violent crime and whether better access to treatment might prevent these kinds of tragedies. Manhard's heroin use was clearly a major contributing factor in his behavior and decisions throughout this incident. While the vast majority of people struggling with addiction never become violent and never commit serious crimes, the combination of severe addiction with relationship problems, mental health issues, and other stressors can sometimes create exactly the kind of explosive and dangerous situation that occurred here. This reality raised questions about whether better, more accessible mental health services and addiction treatment programs might have prevented this tragedy if Manhard had been able to get help for his drug problem earlier, before his behavior escalated to violence. If there had been some form of intervention before his crisis point, perhaps through family, friends, or the healthcare system, would any of this have happened? Such speculation is ultimately unprovable and hypothetical, but it highlights the critically important role that accessible mental health services and addiction treatment play as a form of crime prevention, not just as individual healthcare. As time passed and the initial wave of intense local media coverage gradually faded from the headlines, the Joseph Manhard hostage situation became another entry in the statistical records of officer-involved shootings in the state of Utah. For the vast majority of people who had heard about it in the news, it faded into a vague memory of something that had happened to other people in another city, one of many frightening news stories that blend together over time. But for those who were directly involved and personally affected, the events of September 10, 2021 remained vividly present and would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The family who had been held hostage would always remember and could never forget that terrible morning when their normal lives were turned completely upside down by a stranger climbing through their window and pointing a gun at them. Law enforcement officers involved in the response and resolution would remember it as a textbook example of a hostage situation that could very easily have ended with multiple innocent deaths, but was successfully resolved through careful tactical planning, skilled negotiation efforts, precise marksmanship, and one carefully placed shot at exactly the right moment. And Joseph Anthony Manhard's own family, his parents and siblings, would remember it as the day they lost a son and brother to a devastating combination of drug addiction, catastrophically poor choices, mental health crisis, and escalating violence that spiraled completely out of control in less than 48 hours, ending with his death at age 32.